Okay, thank you guys for doing that. I was sitting at breakfast this morning, and some of you may know Dr. Peter Beamish, who I work with at Avondale, and he was telling me that they had just celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, which was pretty impressive. And Peter turned to his wife and he said, "Do you think we have a good marriage?" Which is probably not a bad question to ask after 40 years of marriage. Do we have a good marriage? She turned to him. I actually don't know his wife, so I don't know what her first name is. She turned to him and she said, "Yeah, I think we have a good marriage." And Peter, being Peter, any of you that know Peter Beamish will not be surprised, he turns to her and he says, "Why do you think that would be? What do you think has made a good marriage?" And Peter was hoping that she would say, "Well, you just are an amazing husband." Instead, she deflated his ego just a little bit by turning to him and saying, "It's because you away so much." I would like to think this morning that whether you're away from your spouse a lot or whether you are together a lot, that some of what we share may help make your relationship just a little bit better, even if it's already fantastic. So, where actually is the problem? What actually is the issue, and why is it that relationship advice, relationship gurus, programs like Married at First Sight, books come out every year in popular psychology, some of them helpful, some questionably so. Why is it that we have such an interest and fascination in something that in my parents' era was hardly talked about? You see, there's been a shift. When my parents got married in 1947, after the end of World War II, they got married in Austria, where our family are from, the expectations were very, very different than a couple who got married today, or even the couple who got married when you got married, which might be 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago for some of you. The expectation was that there would be a high level of commitment and that people would stick with marriage no matter what. My parents, the way I would describe my parents' marriage is that it wasn't good. But the thought of my mother leaving was never an option. She was never going to leave, even though it was an abusive marriage, and I saw her in tears many times as a kid growing up. You know, the saddest thing, one of the saddest things that I've heard was when I was 15 and my mother said to me, well, there were two things my mother said to me that I remember as an adolescent. One was, "I think your father is the selfishest, sorry, let me start that again. I think your father is the most selfish man that I've ever met." And another thing that she said to me was, "Being married to your father is the cross that Jesus has asked me to bear." Whoa. When you're 16 or so, that hits you hard, and I've never forgotten it, and I still get emotional thinking about that now. Being married to your father is the cross that Jesus has given me to bear. But leaving what was not a physically abusive, but certainly an emotionally abusive marriage was never an option for my mother. It was about commitment. And the fact that there really wasn't much passion, and the fact that there really wasn't much emotional intimacy, was unfortunate, but not a reason not to be there. Oh, how things have changed. So now, when you ask people, why are you leaving the marriage? What's your reason for considering divorce? They may say something like, "Well, my needs are just not being met in this relationship. I'm just not getting my needs met. I'm just not able to be myself. I can't realize my potential while I'm in this marriage." You see, very different language. And we've gone from one extreme to the other, as we tend to do in society, and we've gone from the emphasis on a commitment at all costs and at marriage at all costs, to now seeing that marriage is about getting my needs met, and not getting my needs met is a reason to consider perhaps leaving. And I think part of the reason for that is that we have moved to a huge emphasis now on romantic love. Romantic love wasn't really a thing in marriage in the 1700s, in the 1800s. People often got married, marriages arranged by families in order to bring families together. Parents chose a partner based on compatibility, based on he comes from a good family, so therefore you should marry him. Now, of course, it's all about romantic love. And if the rom-coms give us any guidance at all, it's all about feelings. It's got to feel right. It's got to feel good. And I remember someone saying to me who was having an affair, and they said, how can something that feels so good be wrong? How can something that feels so good be wrong? Interesting. This almost obsession as a society that we have with romantic love and chemistry is not something the research really backs up. There isn't actually a correlation between the amount of chemistry you experience with somebody and whether or not you'll be together and happy in 40 years' time. No correlation. But there are correlations between certain behaviors that could be observed. And we're going to talk about that this morning. So that's one of our problems, is the overemphasis on chemistry and romantic love. Whoa. I have just managed to kill that somehow. There we go. Have you heard this figure before? Over 50% of marriages fail. Have you heard that? It's rubbish. It's actually rubbish. It's not true in America, and it's not true in Australia. It's even less true in Australia. The divorce rate is higher in America than Australia. But in Australia, it's hard to work out the exact divorce rate because how are you measuring it? People who got married when? Yeah, over how many years? But some of the best estimates are that the divorce rate is probably around 1 in 3, maybe a little bit higher, 33, maybe 38%. But you see, as soon as you say, well, you know, you've only got 50% chance of a marriage surviving, people go, oh, well, let's give it a shot, but, you know, it's 1 in 2. And immediately people get this idea that there's a very good chance of it not working. What I want to suggest to you this morning is you actually have a lot of control over that. Not totally, because your partner has control as well, but you and your partner have the majority of control over that and whether it works or not. Do you often hear stories about good marriages, or do you more often hear stories about bad marriages? Which ones? The bad, isn't it? The bad ones when you go, oh, I feel so sorry for her. He said this to her last night. Whoa, and he does that regularly. Oh, wow, I feel so sorry for him. She's out doing, yeah. That's what we hear about. How often do we actually highlight two people who've lived together for 50 years and are still absolutely delighted that they can be with each other? How often do we tell those stories? And they're out there. John Gottman, who I will introduce you to shortly, one of the leading researchers in what makes marriages work, he called those people the masters of marriage. He talked about the disasters of marriage and the masters of marriage. And we talk about the disasters of marriage because they make juicy gossip, but we don't really talk about the masters of marriage, and we don't look at those relationships to see what are those people doing well. And that's some of what we want to do this morning. I think I'm actually going to relocate this here in the middle a little bit more. You good there? Okay, that's better. Now I won't have to keep going backwards and forwards. I would suggest to you that one of the things that we underestimate is the complicated nature of living with somebody and sharing everything from the toilet that you use through to your very bodies as you engage in physical intimacy. And I think we underestimate how complex that actually is. How much training did you get when you learnt to drive a car? Just tell me, how many hours did you have to do? How many hours did your children have to do to learn to drive a car? 100? I think it's about 120 in New South Wales, if I remember correctly. How many hours of training did you do before you got married? How many workshops? How many books did you read? How many courses did you do? None. You see, that's the problem, isn't it? We don't prepare people for the two most important tasks in life other than our discipleship and our walk with Jesus. Other than that, the two most important things we do are parenting and marriage, and we are ill-prepared for either of those. See, one of the things that happens that nobody told me about when I got married at 24 is that when you go into marriage, there is a brown paper bag attached to your leg. Not sure if it's the left leg or the right leg. I don't think it matters. But attached to one of your legs is a brown paper bag. Now, your partner, when they come into the marriage, they also have a brown paper bag attached to one of their legs. And at first, stuff in the paper bag, all the stuff from your family of origin, your parents' marriage, the way they did it, what you saw, any trauma you went through, any bad breakups you had as a teenager when you fell in love, all that kind of stuff is stuffed in the brown paper bag because you don't want your new partner to see any of that because it's ugly stuff. So you put it in the brown paper bag and you tie it up with string. But unfortunately, as much as you think you got rid of it, it's actually attached to your leg. You drag it into your relationship, and over time, the brown paper bag starts to disintegrate, and little things come out. And you do things and you say things that are strangely reminiscent of things that your mother said to your father, or your father said to your mother, or things that you saw that you vowed and declared you would never do once you got married because you realized they weren't very good. And all of your stuff plays with all of their stuff. And together a third entity is created, which we call a system, a couple system. And that system can either work really well or work not so well, or work really, really terribly and actually be damaging and destructive. The stuff that you have from previous relationships, that's all in that brown paper bag. And there's voices in your head. Do you know that? We all have voices in our head. Doesn't mean you have schizophrenia and you need to be on Thorazine or any heavy medication. No. We all have voices in our head. Things that we say to ourselves unconsciously, we call that self-talk. And the things we say that we often not even aware that we are saying can be really unhelpful. Can be really unhelpful to fostering good relationships. Our expectations may be totally unrealistic. For example, we may have the expectation that the way we felt about our partner, and the romantic love and the massive sexual attraction we had in the first year of dating and in the first few months of marriage, that's going to stay exactly the same. Well, newsflash, it doesn't. It doesn't. It changes. Romantic love hangs around for about 6 months to 2 years. A little bit shorter if you start sleeping with your partner fairly quickly and you take, all the mystery's gone fairly quickly. So does that mean there's no romance in long-lasting marriages? Of course not. But you actually have to invite it back. You have to make room for it. You go away for a weekend together, you do a date night, and you go, oh, wow, I feel like I'm falling in love again with my partner. But it doesn't happen easily and naturally and spontaneously like it does when chemistry is doing most of the work. All right. Maybe we need to start by kind of having a model of love. And one of the best that I know comes from Robert Sternberg. And this is what he suggested. It's called a triangular theory of love, and you will shortly know why. There it is. And he says that all three elements are important in the relationship, but one or two of them can be more predominant at different stages in our relationship. So passion is very, very strong right up, while commitment goes stronger the longer we are together. Intimacy, we mean closeness and connectedness and bondedness. And ideally, both intimacy and commitment should increase as we go. And passion will come and go depending on stress, depending on hormones, depending on all kinds of things. Let me introduce you to two people that I mentioned before, John and Julie Gottman. Who has heard of the work of John and Julie Gottman? Okay. All right, a few of you. Great. I know my dear friend, Dr. Trafford Fisher, came up, I think, a couple of years ago, and he did something on Gottman. It is some of the best stuff around, and I would strongly advise you, even if you don't go out and buy one or two of his books, get on the website, gottman.org, and have a look at some of his work. And there's helpful summaries and praise there on gottman.org. So he started studying couples in the early 70s. He set up what became affectionately known as the Love Lab on the campus of Washington State University in Seattle. And the campus, from what I've heard him say, has a beautiful lake, and they had an apartment that overlooked the lake. And they would invite couples to spend the weekend in the apartment free of charge. They just had to be aware that they had to wear heart rate monitors. They had to wear devices that detected if they were getting hot and sweaty at all. And they had to have some cameras in the rooms. Now, it wasn't like Big Brother, so it wasn't creepy. There was no, cameras were switched off at 6 o'clock, and there was none in the bathrooms, and, So it was all good done very ethically. But out of the years that Love Lab ran, Gottman got 670 hours of videotape. And he was a mathematician before he became a psychologist. So he analysed it very, very carefully. Kept stopping the tape and going, okay, what's going on here? When she says this, what does he do? When he says that, what's her body language? And they tracked all of this. And then they did what we call longitudinal studies, and they followed those couples up, some of them for up to 20 years, so that we can be fairly confident in the results. Gottman has shown in 7 different studies that he can predict with 90% accuracy whether a couple is going to survive in their marriage, roughly how long the marriage will survive, after chatting to them for just 20 or 30 minutes. Gottman's comment when I've heard him present is, I don't get invited to dinner parties anymore. Because couples really don't want to think he's sitting there going, yeah, these guys have got no chance at all. But the studies keep coming back with about 91, 92% accuracy when they follow the couples up. And he can tell you that, well, this marriage, probably around about 6 years, this marriage about 16 years. There's two types of marriages that fail that he identified, and we'll go through them shortly. All right, what are some of the myths that we have about relationships? Unresolved conflicts cause marital breakdown. Not true, he found. He found that 70% of what he called perpetual problems, problems that never get solved, are there in good long-term relationships. They don't get solved because they're about personality characteristics, they're about traits, they're about preferences, and so they don't get solved. But what he found was that couples whose marriages last find a way of dealing with those differences, and they manage those perpetual problems so that it doesn't take away from the good stuff in their relationship. That's the difference. Another myth is good communication fixes most things. I hear this a lot. If you just learn to communicate, well, let me tell you something. I've had people sit in my therapy room. So my training is as a couples counsellor, and I've had people sit in my therapy room and communicate very, very effectively, calmly, with no blaming, with no you statements, all doing, the good I statement thing. They have calmly told their partner that they no longer wish to be married. It's excellent communication. You see, communication is really helpful and it's important, but it's not everything. It's not everything. There are some people whose communication actually isn't all that great, but they have an amazing attachment, an amazing bond, and they've had to limit the expectations about communication. Let me talk a little bit about my wife. I can do that because she's 800 kilometres away, so it's safe. She knows I talk about her. She knows I talk about her in class quite a lot. My wife is South African. She's British South African. She's very matter of fact. She's very grounded, and that's good because I'm not always well grounded. She's very, very grounded. She's a master of detail, and I'm hopeless at detail. Do you know I managed last night? How many were here last night when I came over and the trivia night? No, most of you weren't here. I came here last night and I managed in just that one trip to lose my hotel key. Like, that was real smart, wasn't it? I go back to, the hotel just 3 kilometres down the road and there's no key. And to this day, even today, I don't know where it is. I managed to lose it. My wife wouldn't do that. She'd probably know exactly where it is. And if she came up here now, she'd probably find it underneath a chair somewhere. I don't know. I'm a counsellor. So what do I want to do when there's a problem and my wife and I have some tension? What do I want to do? I want to talk. Yeah, I'm that guy that says we need to talk. And I can just see my wife going, oh, anything but talking. Why do we have to talk? And so my wife, it was never modeled in her family how to talk. Her father migrated I think he was an infant when he came out from England, very English, grown up in South Africa. And so it was never modeled to my wife how to talk about feelings. Like, why would you do that? And so my wife's favourite response is when I say something, she'll say, what's the point of talking? It's not going to change anything. And I say, yeah, but we might feel better. She said, you've made up your mind. You're not going to change. And I go, not necessarily. But by that time, she shut down and yeah. And we've had to learn how to negotiate that. It's a perpetual problem. I wish my wife would love talking about feelings and telling me exactly how she felt. That would be so good. And that happens a little more now than it did when we first got together. And for that, I'm thankful. But she's never going to be like me. I think abstractly. I think big picture. She thinks detail. So when we first got together, all she wanted to do, if I talked about something, was to fix the problem. And if you have had any background at all in counselling, you know, for counsellors, that's like the unforgivable sin. You know, my students will fail immediately if they try to fix their clients. And so I would tell her about something while we were dating, and she would say, oh. And she now, I must say, has got to the point that she doesn't do that anymore, and she just kind of nods her head. And I assume that she's listening. So I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. She just kind of nods and doesn't say too much, because she said she's scared that, you know, I'll say, you're trying to fix me and I don't want to be fixed. You see, our communication, I would argue, between my wife and I is better than it was. It's never going to be exactly what I would like it to be, because I'm not married to somebody who wants to communicate or has the need to communicate in the same way that I do. But we manage that a lot better now than we ever did. And we have some systems in place that actually help us with that. Anger is destructive in relationships, particularly if it goes both ways. In other words, reciprocal anger. You get a little bit annoyed at your partner, and they fire up and say, oh, would you just pull your head in? Is that a healthy relationship? Yeah, it is actually. It's normal. It's normal. What is dangerous is what happens after that. What Gottman found was that reciprocal anger, one person getting frustrated at the other and the other getting a bit frustrated at the fact that their partner got frustrated, you know, my frustration to match your frustration. He actually found that that was not collated with divorce. What was, however, was when people got angry, annoyed, frustrated with each other, and then they kept it going. And he called that an attack-defense pattern with escalation. This is where one person goes, you know, I really, you know, I'm so mad with you, and the other person says, you've got nothing to be mad about. You know, I should be mad with you. And it goes backwards and forwards. The anger and the intensity gets worse and worse until people say things that should never be said. And that's when it's destructive. I remember a couple many years ago coming to me, and 2 years ago, in the middle of an argument, he had said to her, I wished I'd never married you. He had apologized 1,000 times. He had told her he didn't mean it. He had told her he was simply angry. And her response was, but you said it. You said it, and I can't get past that. One of the other myths I want to blow up this morning is this idea that we would need to tell our partner everything that goes through our mind. It's a recipe for disaster. A lot of what goes through my mind comes in and needs to go straight out. I don't need to tell that to anybody, you know. Even some of the stuff that stays in my head is not worth repeating because it's rubbish. This idea that good marriage is about telling a partner everything, it's destructive. The times that I have wondered whether I should be married to Jill or not, do I need to tell her that? Actually, a year or two ago, I said, babe, were there times in our marriage, it's the second marriage for both of us, we've now been married 12 years this year. I said, babe, were there ever times when you seriously questioned what you were thinking? And she looked at me, she said, yeah, there were. And I said, yeah, me too. But at the time, would it have been helpful to tell her? No. And would it have been helpful for me to hear it from her? Nope. You see, there are some things that are my problem. The fact that I was questioning in the first few years, had we done the right thing, that's my problem. It's my problem to go, what do I need to do to make sure I get this marriage to a point where I'm not questioning anymore? What can I do? And I can honestly tell you that that question isn't even on the radar anymore and hasn't been for a few years because of the way that we've been able to grow and work out how to live together. All right, what's some of the research tell us? How are we going for time, mate? How much time have we got left? Just keep going. We'll be here at lunchtime. We'll have lunch served up to us, you know. For my couples class at Avondale, I do a 3-hour class, so I can do this for 3 hours, you know. So, happily married couples behave like good friends and handle their conflicts in gentle, positive ways. They may not start gently and positively, but they end that way. Gottman identified that couples that do well do something called repair attempts. So in other words, when they feel they're getting quite annoyed with their partner, when they feel that the conversation is not going in a good way, they make a repair attempt. And a repair attempt is not me saying to Jill, I'm sorry, babe, I was 100% wrong. I had no right at all to even question you about that. That's unrealistic. I'd be lying if I did that. But I may be able to say to Jill, I know you're going through a tough time as well. I know that. I just find it really hard when I'm the punching bag. Just acknowledging that she's going through a hard time is enough to just bring down the energy level, to keep us out of that attack defense pattern with escalation. Does that make sense? Because that's what you want to avoid, because that's a spiral, and that's going down, and that's not going to end in a good place. So one person, and it doesn't matter who it is, one person needs to kind of go, it's time for a repair attempt. I need to back off a little bit. Maybe I need a little time out. Maybe I need to do something because this is starting to get into an attack defense pattern. I'm attacking because I don't think you've heard me. Well, I'm defending because you're attacking me. And that sets up a feedback loop that just feeds on itself. 10 minutes? Was that Goldsey who said that? Oh, communication guy. Okay, well, let's see what we can do in 10 minutes. I'll have to tell those stories. 15 minutes, can I bargain for 15 minutes? That would be good. Yes, all right, the saints are with me. Happily married couples are able to repair negative interactions during an argument, and they're able to process negative emotions. What can make marriage work is surprisingly simple. Happily married couples aren't smarter, richer, or more psychologically astute than others, but in their day-to-day lives, they've hit upon a dynamic that keeps their negative thoughts and feelings, which all couples have, from overwhelming their positive ones. They have what I call an emotionally intelligent marriage. A lot of work has been done on these 4 things. And in fact, Gottman, who is not a Christian, he's actually Jewish, but he knows enough about the book of Revelation that he called these 4 the horsemen of the apocalypse. And he said, when they start galloping through your marriage, the end is in sight. The end is near. Criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Contempt had the highest correlation with marital breakdown. Contempt is where I'll give you the message that not only do I not like what you've done, I actually don't like you. This is where there are put-downs. There might be name-calling. Contempt is, I really feel superior to you. You know, you're beneath me. Criticism is dangerous when it's not criticism of an action, but it's a criticism of the person. It isn't put in, I found this really hard when you didn't check with me before you went off for the day. I would have liked to have a conversation about that. That's very different to going, you know, you're so selfish. You just took off in the car, you didn't care what I was doing for the rest of the day, and you just went shopping. And you probably blew a lot of money as well. You're so selfish. That criticism, that's what's dangerous. Not bringing up an action that you're not happy with, which is very legitimate in relationships. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Stonewalling is when you just shut down, the ultimate power trip. I'm just not talking to you, just shutting down. Emotional withdrawal predicts later divorcing, average of 16 years after wedding compared to less than 6 years when the 4 horsemen are present. So this is how Gottman analyzes couples and their conversation. He looks for any of the four horsemen, and if they're starting to gallop through, he gives it about 6 or 7 years. If he sees emotional disengagement, this is where people are on parallel railway tracks. They're going the same direction, still living in the same house, but they're not connected across the tracks. There's no connection, just parallel tracks with no connection across there. That's what we call emotional withdrawal. What do people do in relationships that work? They make, Gottman found, bids for connection. I'm going to go through this a lot quicker than I would like to, but it's important. I want to look at that last point. In marriages headed for divorce, husbands disregarded wives' bids 82% of the time. In stable marriages, this just happens 19% of the time. What do we mean by bid? A bid is any endeavour to connect. It might be, sorry, maybe just a drink of water. It may be by asking your partner whether they'd like a cup of tea. And your partner may just totally ignore you because they'd prefer to watch the footy. That's disregarding your partner's bid. And all of us miss some of the bids. Thanks, mate. Some of the bids that our partners make. All of us miss some of those. But it's the percentage of bids that we miss. Isn't that incredible that you can actually measure this stuff? Marriages that are headed for divorce, 80% of the bids were ignored that wives made. This is what people do in relationships that work. They make frequent bids for connection, and those bids can often be very trivial. They can just be small conversations, small talk. What Gottman found is that it's all of the little things in relationships that actually make the difference between whether it works or not. And that's why I've said that actually Gottman's research is really good news, because it's not rocket science, this stuff. Yeah, coming in the house and making sure that we ask a partner how their day was. You'd be surprised how many people don't do that. Just walk in, hi honey, straight off to, keep working on the laptop, rather than, let me just take a moment, let's just sit down. Where my wife and I can, we actually sit down when we both come home from work, 5 or 10 minutes. What can I get you to drink? And we sit down, okay, how was your day? What happened? The world and my work and even dinner is not going to suffer if we take 10 minutes just to connect with each other and to check in. Soft startup simply means that when you want to bring up an issue, the way you start the conversation will determine how you finish. You can come in very accusing, or you can come in very gently. And depending how you do that will determine whether it actually ends well and whether you're managing the issue appropriately. Love maps is another thing that Gottman found. He found that people in good, long-lasting relationships knew lots of stuff about each other, and in order to know that stuff, they asked questions. If you want to know how to do this, it'll cost you $2.99, and it's called Gottman Love Maps. It's an app that you can buy for $2.99. $2.99 well spent. And next time you go out to a restaurant and you realize that you're actually just sitting there, or worse, one of you is on your phone. You don't do that, do you, when you go out to dinner? Really hope you don't. Yeah, you see it. Jill and I will go to a restaurant and we'll look around and we spy on other couples. We kind of go, they've just spent $100 on dinner, and guess what they're doing? Exactly what they do at home. They're both on their phones. They've just wasted $100 because they're not connecting at all. You can get out your little app from Gottman and you can ask these questions, 50 questions there, to help fill out the love map of your partner. And you might be surprised that you actually don't know the answers to all those 50 questions. positive sentiment override, which Gottman again found was important, is when you've got something in the bank. If you've got something in the bank of your relationship, you can get away with a lot more. If Jill and I are in a good place, and I commit one of the cardinal sins, there are a number of cardinal sins in our house. One might be, for example, the dishcloth. You know the dishcloth that you have? We have these, far too expensive dishcloths. And I leave it in the sink. And it kind of gets grot on it. Does he do that as well? You do that. And that's, if Jill and I are in positive sentiment override, that's not a big deal. But if we're in negative sentiment override, I'm likely to get a comment like, how many times do I need to ask you not to leave that? It gets grotty and I hate, It seems small, but remember, it's the small stuff. It's the small stuff that makes marriage. This is some of the stuff I was talking about before, so I'll go through it very quickly. 69% of problems in good marriages don't get resolved. Unresolved issues are not actually the problem. There's the importance of sorting out the solvable problems from the perpetual problems. Perpetual problems get managed. Solvable problems can be solved. I'm just going to go past that quote and that one. All right, there's a summary of all of that. If any of you want a copy of that, I can give it to a PDF to Paul Goltz and he can get it to you. All right, I just, in the 5 minutes that I still have left, I'm sure. Shaunti Feldheim is a social researcher, not a couples therapist, but a social researcher. And she wanted to find out what makes people happy in marriage. Not a psychologist, comes from a social research background. And so she found these are the things that make him happy, according to her research, and she had fairly large sample sizes. Did surveys. Very committed Christian lady. I heard her speak when she came out to Australia. Written some really good books. Effort being noticed and receiving sincere thanks. If I cut the grass and my wife doesn't notice, I feel a little wounded inside. Why? Well, from a psychodynamic point of view, it's because when I was a boy, my mother did that, patted me on the head and told me I'm a good boy. And I felt good, and now I'm still looking for someone to do that for me, to pat me on the head. It's a real man thing. Very, very common with men. We want women to notice the things that we've done. And when I say to my wife, I cut the grass, did you notice? And she said, well, I did the washing, did you notice? And I go, yeah, but washing, you do that every 3 days. Cutting the grass, that's a big deal, I got to get hot and sweaty and We like it when you mention us in front of others. When you brag about us, because it reminds us that you really do value us and that we are very important in your life. Shows that she desires him sexually and that he pleases her sexually. It's interesting that while most married couples have sex, most couples never talk about the sex they have. They just do it and then go, okay, good night. Yeah, love you too. And it's all over, And funny, isn't it? We do such an intimate thing to have sexual intercourse with our spouse, but we actually don't talk about, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, is there anything that would actually make it more pleasurable for you? We don't have those sort of conversations. Oh no, we're embarrassed. Well, hang on, we've just been totally naked and shared bodily fluids with each other. That, surely talking shouldn't be as embarrassing as that. Funny how we do this stuff. We're conditioned in certain ways. What makes her happy? He takes her hand when they're walking together. Leaves her a message by voicemail, email or text to say, hey, I'm thinking of you. Shows physical affection, especially when in public, I would say. Especially in public. When we are proud of our wives, hey, this is my wife, and I'm proud to say this is not just a person I hang out with, this is my wife, this is the love of my life. Tell her and means it that she's beautiful. Pulls himself out of his bad mood instead of withdrawing. You know, you might remember the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. You know, a lot of that wasn't real accurate. And one of the problems I have with that book is that it almost justified men just going out to their shed whenever they don't want to communicate and just withdrawing. And that's not really healthy. So, you know, it's my problem if I'm in a bad mood. And yeah, I may need a little bit of time out, but I don't need hours away, leaving my wife feeling that she's ignored and neglected. What else seems to work? Believing the best in each other. Looking for the very best. Criticism thrives on looking for the worst. Shaunti says, go to bed mad. This idea that you should always never go to bed mad would mean some of us would never go to bed. Sometimes you need to go to bed mad, let it rest. Don't keep flogging a dead horse trying to sort out something that won't work because you're both actually flooded. You've both got the fight and flight hormones in your head, the adrenaline, the cortisol, all that stuff is happening, and you're not going to sort it out. And you actually need a good night's sleep before you can sort it out. Keep score. Don't we do that in marriages? We keep score. But you know what we do? We keep score of the wrongs of our partner. We keep score of the good things they didn't do. And Shaunti Feldheim suggests that we keep score, but we keep score of the good things. In other words, we keep score of that and we actually share that with our partner. How about you have a meeting every week with your partner? You could call it State of the Union if you like. And you start that off by sharing with your partner 3 things that you notice that they did that you really appreciate in this last week. Then if you do want to talk about a problem or something that needs to be managed better, you've got a much better chance of that conversation going well because you've done very good soft startup. Avoid brutal honesty. Honesty doesn't have to be brutal. I've had people in couples therapy, and men tend to do this more than women, but women can as well. The man will say, well, I just say it the way I see it. That's all. But you can see that when he talks, she shrinks inwards. She just collapses on the inside because she's so hammered by the way he's put it. Honesty doesn't have to be brutal to be honesty. There can be a gentleness in honesty. And hanging out with each other, spending time together, fairly obvious. Why can it be made simple? Because it's more about behaviours and choices than it is about compatibility. We've put too much emphasis on compatibility in society. We need to put more emphasis on what people do that works. Because there's stuff that works and there's stuff that doesn't work. And the good thing is, what we've talked about this morning, you don't have to do any of it perfectly. Isn't that good? Because I don't do anything perfectly, ever. And maybe nor do you, because we live in an imperfect, messed up, broken world. Anything even small that you can do a little bit differently can make a difference. All right. Are there any questions, comments? I'm sure we are right out of time, but I do want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. You're also very welcome to come up to me afterwards. I'll hang about for a while and happy to chat to you. Yeah.
I loved what you said about go to bed mad, and that's actually the first time I'd heard that, and it made sense when you mentioned the cortisol and all of that things. But I'm just wondering, how does that, correlate with the Bible verse, never let the sun go down on your anger?
Yeah. Yeah.
So as soon as you said that, I thought of that Bible verse, and I'm like, I really want to ask you that. So I love that you're giving us that opportunity. But please explain how "Go to Bed Mad"
As
aligns
I said
with
that, I
that
thought
verse.
somebody's going to quote that verse to me.
Yes.
And I don't have an exact answer other than I think the Bible gives general principles. I don't think it's saying in every instance. I don't think when the Bible says that, it says 100% of the time, in every instant, in every relationship, that's what you need to do. And if you are digging yourself into a hole, and Jill and I certainly have done that, it's 11:30 at night, and I want to keep something going because I have this anxiety that will only be quelled once we actually talk about it and I feel heard, and my wife was beyond it an hour ago, there's really no point. I have to then suck it up and go, yep, I've just got to live with this. My anxiety now is my issue, and I can't demand of my wife to rescue me from it. So I would say as a general principle, is that a good biblical principle? Yes. Does it work 100% of the time with all couples? No, I don't think so. It doesn't work for Jill and I. And I've learnt that in our years of marriage, that sometimes I need to let it go for 2 or 3 days until I can come back to it and we can have a constructive conversation about that, and I'll go, oh, good, now I feel heard. Good. Yeah.
Awesome. Do we have anyone else? Yep.
I'm just wondering, like, for the woman in the relationship, say you haven't got like a lot of your bids met in the past and things like that, and there's been hurtful things, how would you come to terms with that as a woman, like with hurt in a relationship? How do you move past that?
An ongoing relationship that's still going?
Yes.
Yeah. I think one of the things that helps you is if there is some way of your partner actually hearing that has been hurtful, having your bids ignored. And you may need to go to professional therapy for that to happen. That may not happen in the context of the home. It may happen in professional therapy, but I think it starts with being heard. Because if I'm heard, then I've got some hope that things may change even a little bit. I think that's where it has to start. Now, if your partner is not going to go to therapy with you, in that situation, then you should still go on your own to see what you need to do and what your options are. And one of them may be to go, okay, I am not ready to leave this marriage, but I also know that this marriage isn't going to be great. It never has been, it probably never will be, but I'm choosing to be here. And I've sometimes confronted couples with that. If this is as good as it gets, what will you do? And some have said, well, I'm not going anywhere. We have kids, we're going to stay there. And for some people, it's making peace with putting the expectations way down. Now, that's not the ideal. That's not the ideal. Sometimes, however, it is the real. Does that make sense? It's a difficult one, yeah.
Anyone else? Just raise your hands up if you have a question.
I saw Paul Gold stalking me. I think he wants us
He's
to
at the
wind
back
up.
there.
Yeah,
He's at the back.
look, he's...
So we've got no one else? No questions? If you want to ask any further questions or concerns, or Paul would be at the front here, and you're more than welcome to come and have a chat with him.
What's that big grin on your face, Paul?
He's got a question. Paul's got a question. No question. No questions. All right.
Is that because Paul has a great marriage? Because he's a perfect husband. Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry, this man up here.
Oh, at the back.
Perfect husband. Perfection right there.
Can I ask you one question, Paul?
Yeah.
You talked about it being the percentage of bids that you miss, and that meaning bad marriages would do that and then break up after 16 years or whatever it was. In previous relationships, having a partner who was very incredibly clingy and needy and smothering so that it felt like you couldn't breathe, there was way too many bids to try and meet them all. Obviously that relationship ended. How do you fix that by meeting all those bids if those bids are too intense? Is that another problem, or is that...
And see, that's what we would call an idiosyncratic problem. I mean, every now and again, yes, that happens, and if you try to meet 80 or 90% of the bids you'll be exhausted and have a breakdown. Yeah. But that's a unique type of relationship, and there may be some mental health issues going on there that actually cause that. And if there are mental health issues, then there has to be boundaries. But you can still make sure that there are bids that are responded to, as many as possible. And then there has to be a conversation about that, about the fact that I am getting very, very drained in this relationship, and I'm going to have to put some boundaries in place, and I know that's hard for you, and I'm sorry that's going to be hard for you. There has to be that kind of empathic conversation, I think, and an understanding that if I put boundaries up, it's going to be hard for the person. But we're talking about special situations where there are very likely mental health issues. Yeah.
If we don't have any more, then... you got a question?
So the question is, what is overstepping the mark when it comes to, like, where does a relationship go into domestic violence?
Yep.
From being we tolerate a lot. We do.
Be submissive,
What's the step too far? Is there just one step, or is it because it really. Yep.
There's one step, but it's on a continuum of severity. Yeah. Firstly, I mean, my rule, and I have this with the couples that I work with, is that any touch that is done in anger is abusive. Yeah, any touch at all that is done in anger. Doesn't matter whether it's a little shove or whether it's blocking someone from a doorway or whatever, anything like that, as far as I'm concerned, that's abusive and not appropriate. I think anger where a person is losing control. Yeah, anger in itself, but that's anger within control. I might be angry, but I know I'm not going to lose it. But when I'm losing it with my partner, that's really scary, and that's much scarier for women than men because of the difference in strength, and most of the perpetrators of domestic violence are men. Not all, but most. I think the other thing that I would say to someone, whether they're tolerating too much, is to check in with how exhausted are they, and are they starting to get resentful, and to be honest with themselves, how much are they starting to resent the situation. And then that resentment, I think, has to be taken seriously, because it'll get to the point where the resentment is so strong that they can't go back. That the bridge gets burned and there's no way back. And I've worked with couples like that where it just got to the point where going back to the marriage and keeping the marriage going was not an option because of the resentment. Sorry? Well, there's such a thing as financial abuse. We know financial abuse happens. The key with abuse, with domestic violence, is it's about control. And, whether that means that I'm checking my wife's phone to make sure there are no messages from males that I don't know on there, or whether, I'm only giving her a certain amount of money and not access to the bank account because I don't trust her, all of that, and there's many instances of that. Micromanaging when it comes to money. I really believe that, talking of finance is really important for people in the marriage to have some money that they spend that they're not accountable to for their partner. We call it squirrel money in our marriage. It's squirrel money because it can be squirreled away. Most of my wife's money gets spent on presents for the grandchildren. Most of mine gets spent on coffee. But as soon as, yet another present comes in the house and my wife can see me starting to go, what? She said, squirrel money. And that means, shut up, don't ask. Remember, I can spend that on whatever I like and go, yep, sorry, babe. Yeah, that's up. And I think that's really, really important.